Good. One of the benefits of staying home a lot is that the commuter time is greatly decreased across the nation, which means people have more time to sleep in and have breakfast. So if you're going to have a breakfast, what better breakfast than a nice, fluffy, crispy, warm English muffin melted with a little bit of butter on top? And I don't mean that facetiously. It's actually quite delicious. You know, you wash your hands, you make hamotzi. It's wonderful. And then you have your English muffin. And then for lunch, you say, you know what, I want to have another English muffin, but this time I want to have it with deli meat. Aha, now you have a problem. You had it with your butter, that was fine. But if you have it with deli meat, the issue is you're going to be having meat and dairy because English muffins are made with dairy in them and not OUD, dairy, the Orthodox Union dairy equipment with actual dairy in them. As a side note, apparently there are pareve ones, which actually we'll come back later, makes this whole story even more complicated. But the chance that someone will have a piece of bread and accidentally, have it with cheese and accidentally have it with meat is a real issue. And supposedly it used to happen. It doesn't happen much more anymore. And the reason, which we'll discuss tonight, is the reason that anytime you buy a kosher challah, it is always going to be pareve. You are not going to find a challah that has dairy or meat in it. When I say meat, there are certain breads that could potentially be made with fat. Now, I don't know the whole story, and I'm sure there are more nuances, but something I was told was that there was a bakery in town, it was kosher, and they wanted to start making bread with dairy, and that is one of, if not the issue. Again, I don't want to spread gossip, but it might be one of the reasons that they lost their hechsher. And of course, as non-Jews, they're allowed to make dairy bread, but there's a Jewish law that we cannot make any bread with dairy in it. So the question, as I sort of alluded to, is the why, and are there exceptions to it? And that will lead us to the main question of tonight. If that's true, that you can't make dairy bread, how is it okay to have actual dairy English muffins, which have an accepted kosher symbol from the Orthodox Union? So before we jump in, any quick questions before we get started with our first source? Good. So just as a backup, a preamble to this first source, there's nothing about making dairy bread in this rule in the Torah. What the Torah does say 3 times is you shall not cook a kid, a gedi, bechalevimo, in the milk of its mother. And the rabbis interpret that actually in 3 different ways. They say that one is you cannot cook milk and meat together, one is you cannot eat milk and meat together, and one is you cannot benefit from milk and meat together. So not only can I not eat a cheeseburger, I cannot make a cheeseburger. And the third one is if I get a cheeseburger by accident, like someone delivers it, I cannot give it to my pet, nor can I sell it or give it to anyone. I need to throw it out. Milk and meat is really bad. And when I say milk and meat, I mean actual like beef or goat and stuff like that, not chickens. Theoretically, I can make chicken parm and I can sell it, although I can't eat it. And then other things like pork, I can't eat pork, but I could, if I happen to get a job at a restaurant and I have no choice, I can make a pork sandwich, I can make bacon, and I can sell it and feed it to non-Jews, not to other Jews. But milk and meat is uniquely forbidden, and again mentioned 3 times in the Torah. And one of the most unique things about it that the rabbis do talk about, we might touch on in this class, is that meat is kosher. If it's treif meat, it doesn't even matter if there's milk there, but meat is kosher and dairy is kosher on its own. But it's only when you bring them together that they become forbidden. And that's just kind of a weird concept to wrap your head around. It might be obvious, but when you think about it, both of those things are kosher until you combine them. So because of this concern of mixing milk and meat, Tamar, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you for the first source. And this is the mention of the whole rule about dairy bread comes in the Talmud. So it's certainly old. It's around 1500 or so years old as a law. And they include not only the law, but they already touch on some of the exceptions. So Tamar from Psachim, and the reason it comes up in the context of Pesach is when they learn the laws of making matzah, they talk about kosher matzah and what can be in it. And the rule is it can only be flour and water. If you mix anything else in with it, whether it's honey or anything like that, it's no longer kosher for matzah. And that connects to sacrifices. You used to make breads in the temple, etc. But in this conversation about mixing things together in matzah, it makes sense to talk about any kind of mixing with dough. So, b'vakasha, Tamar.
The Gemara adds that this is as Rabbi Joshua said to his sons on the first night of Passover, do not knead for me dough with milk, but from the first night onward, knead my dough for me with milk. The Gemara raises a difficulty, but wasn't it taught in the Baraita throughout the whole year one may not knead dough with milk? And if he kneaded dough with milk, the entire bread is prohibited due to the fact that one will become accustomed to sin by unwittingly eating it with meat. Rather, this is what he is saying. On the first night of Passover, do not knead me dough with honey. However, from then onward, knead me dough with honey.
So just to clarify what's happened so far is they have, differing statements, and they think that he's saying on Pesach, make me matzah with milk in it. And they say, whoa, we have an earlier ruling, a Baraita. It was written around the same time as the Mishnah, so it's before the Talmud, first, second century common era. And so it has a very high level of authority. And we have one that says you may never make any kind of bread. Forget about just Pesach. The whole year you can never have bread with dairy, because you might accidentally, you make your challah, you have it Friday night with your chicken, you have leftover challah, and the next day, you have it, one meal with dairy, and then the next meal you have it with chicken, and you just forget about it. So just make it parav, so you can, because bread is a staple. For them, you have bread at every single meal, and you're always ripping off a piece of the bread, so you don't want to think about, was this my dairy bread or my meat bread? Remember we had the class on onions. And if you cut an onion with a meat knife, it becomes meat. And that can be very confusing. So with bread, where you really, at least they used it all the time, don't confuse yourselves. So the Gemara does what it does, is this rabbi was not implying that you should sin, going against an earlier ruling. He was saying on the first night of Pesach, it has to be pure, just water and flour. And in Israel, where there's only one day of the Chag, on the next nights, you're allowed to add a little honey into it. He never implied milk. That's what it says so far, and they go a little bit more, Tamar, b'vakasha, and if you wish.
And if you wish, say instead that actually Rabbi Joshua said, with milk, as Ravina said, if this bread kneaded with milk is prepared in the shape of an ox's eye, it is permitted. In other words, if one forms this dough in a unique shape, i.e. the eye of an ox, one may eat it, as it is clearly distinguishable from the ordinary bread. Therefore, there is no concern that it will be eaten with meat. Here too, the Baraita is speaking about the case where he told them to prepare this matzah in the shape of an ox's eye.
Thank you. So putting aside the question here about first night of Pesach and matzah can't have anything in it other than flour or water, the Gemara has two answers to his dairy bread. The first one is he didn't mean dairy bread, he meant honey bread. But that's not what he said. So the second answer, which is the one we're going to explore further in a moment, is he did mean dairy bread, but it wasn't sinful. The practice is you can't make a loaf of bread. You can't make a challah that you eat on Shabbos with dairy in it. And by the way, even though they don't mention it, it'll be explicit later. This also means a fat, i.e. animal fat, i.e. meat. Everyone agrees. You can't make it meat or dairy. It has to be parav across the board when you're making a proper loaf of bread. However, if you want to make a small little roll that's in a specific shape. Now here they say in the Hebrew, like ke'en Torah or ke'ayin Torah, like the eye of a tor or shor, ayin ox, then it's fine, because everyone's going to know that bread, or literally just make it in the shape of an ox if it's not idolatrous, but everyone will see that bread and identify it and say, oh, I know that when it's in that shape, then it's dairy. No problem. That seems like a good resolution. If the concern here is people being confused, is this bread dairy or is it meat? But you walk into a store and you know dairy bread is this shape, meat bread is this shape, parav bread is this shape, then you have no problem. And jumping ahead, in Israel, they do something very similar to that with their knishes and things like that. They have, there's laws about what shape dairy, things can be. So we already, fast forward, this becomes a rule. But one of the interesting things here is, does it literally have to be in the eye of an ox? So again, to review, the rabbis are concerned that if you make bread, which is a staple of every meal, either meat or dairy, although here they only mention dairy, people will get confused and they'll have meat bread with a dairy meal or dairy bread with a meat meal. So you just can't do it, with one exception, where the bread is made in such a way that everyone knows it's not a problem. But the question is, what exactly does that mean? Does it literally mean Ke'en Torah, the shape of an ox? And we have two opinions. So the first one, Susan, and they're short, so I'll let you take both one. I think you just have to unmute on your side, Susan. The first one is from Rashi. And he says it's not about the shape of it. Ke'en Torah, like the eye of an ox, means, go ahead, Susan. Uh-oh, did we lose you? Did we lose me?
As the eye of an ox. We've got 5 people now. Okay, as the eye of an ox, this means little in size, like the eye of an ox. Then it is permitted to knead dough with milk that is then eaten up in one go, one sitting.
Excellent, thank you. So Rashi's opinion is that Ke'en Torah doesn't mean that you have to make it in a funny shape. It means if we're making challah for the shul in that giant mixer that's still leaking oil, as far as I know, so don't use it right now, make a massive amount where it's going to be eaten at multiple meals. The chances of somebody making a mistake and eating it with the opposite species, meat with dairy, dairy with meat, are high. But if you make a little roll for yourself, a little biscuit or something like that, it's fine. If you make a small amount. Now, Ke'en Torah, I don't know exactly how big, but it can't be like too much bigger than this. That's pretty small. So Rambam, Maimonides, and others as well, take a different direction. They take it slightly more literally. And Susan, I'll let you take this as well from Rambam's Mishnah Torah in his section on Ma'achalot Asurot, forbidden foods.
Okay. We do not need a loaf with milk. If one needed it with milk, the loaf is forbidden because habit might lead to sin, lest he eat it together with meat.
So pause there for a second. So it's not like, oh, don't do it initially, and if you do it, whatever. It's if you did it, you've made forbidden food. Now I haven't seen anything that says if you made dairy bread, you trafed anything up. If you made it in your oven, you don't have to kosher your oven, but you cannot eat it. It's not I made it, I can eat it now. You have to throw it out, according to this opinion. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I have another question, but I'll get to that later.
Yeah. Do you want to just finish this and ask it?
Yeah, right. I will.
Okay.
We do not dab an oven with animal fat. If, in fact, one dabbed an oven with fat, any loaf is forbidden until one fires the oven, lest one eat milk with that loaf. If one alter the appearance of the bread so that it will be evident that one should not eat meat or milk with it, it is permitted.
Excellent. So the Rambam, now reflecting rabbis between the Talmud and him, the Gaonim, etc., like that, rules, and then other sources in the Talmud, that of course it's not just making dairy bread, it's making meat bread as well. Not because it's inherently treif of itself, but the concern. And again, this is a common thing in kashrut. When I, as a side point, when I started yeshiva, I was told by the upperclassmen, when you learn kashrut for the first time, you'll realize that everything you're doing, you're being extra strict to prevent problems. And there's a lot of leniencies. Everything is there as a safeguard, which is very important to our religion. A lot of our laws are safeguards to make sure we don't accidentally. And then they told me, but when you learn Shabbos, you realize you've never kept Shabbos right a day in your life because it's so much more complicated than you imagine. But this is very consistent with the laws of kashrut. It's to prevent us from accidentally doing something wrong. But what he says is that even if you make a huge challah, he doesn't care about the size, but you make it in the shape of a jug of milk, something distinguishable, then it's fine. So Rashi says make a small amount, and Rambam says it doesn't matter the amount, it has to be made in a specific shape. So before we go on, Susan, you had a question, please.
Before I didn't have a question, and you said that was great, but now I do have one. I'm presuming, of course, that they're assuming that this small roll is not going to be eaten with meat. But what if you never eat meat? Are we going to get to that?
It's so interesting. There's an article by a rabbi I actually mentioned before, Rabbi Chaim Jachter, and he had a little blurb on vegetarian. And what he was saying is that the way that Jewish law develops is there's this phrase lo plukta, which is something like we don't make a distinction, meaning if there's a law because the average person is not careful about, about this, about eating meat with dairy, et cetera, like that, but a few people, like a small percentage, the exception are people that are vegans, we do not make two separate sets of laws. We make one law. So the answer to your question is that in the eyes of the law, this practice, which by the way, we're about to get, and there's a lot of leniencies, et cetera, like that, especially in someone's private home, but ultimately the law is across the board never to do this. And it's not so crazy because what if a vegan person makes a dairy, or maybe not vegan, maybe a vegetarian who never eats meat, but they eat dairy, makes some dairy bread, and then they bring it over to their friend for a shiva call who does eat meat. So the issue, and by the way, that does happen. We buy one loaf of bread and I take out a piece of bread and I make grilled cheese, and then later I'll go out and I'll have, like a salami sandwich. So it's a real thing in a household that eats meat. But again, Jewish law does not make different sets of laws for the most part. There may be exceptions to this lack of exceptions. But this specific law, Rabbi Jachter tells us, based on others' questions, is that vegetarians would not be different. Lo plukta, or lo plug, we just don't make a distinction in the law there. But as you see, there are ways to make dairy bread. You just have to make it in a funny shape. Does that help answer your question?
You have to make it a funny shape and be sure not to eat it with meat.
Exactly. Well, what we're going to see right now is the Shulchan Aruch, because one of the questions is, Rabbi, which is it? Do I have to make a small amount or make it in a funny shape? So Ken, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And I see you have a question as well before you, or you're davening. Okay, because it's almost time. Okay, I'll take this for you and then you'll read after. All right, so the Shulchan Aruch, again, written around 1563 by two rabbis, and I'm not sure if this is Rav Yosef Karo or the Ramah, but it's in the Shulchan Aruch, says, and it lists all of the exceptions. One may not knead dough with milk, lest one come to eat it with meat. We have that. If one did knead it that way, the whole loaf is prohibited even to eat on its own, consistent with the Rambam and what we've learned, unfortunately. And again, I don't think anyone says it trafes up the oven, but you have to throw out that loaf. But unlike milk and meat mixed together, I think you could give it to a dog or a non-Jew, but you can't eat it. Now, he says, if it was a small quantity, which was what Rashi says, moving on to the next page, if it was a small quantity that can be eaten in one sitting, just like Rashi says, or its shape is so unusual that it will be recognizable that it shouldn't be eaten with meat, it is permitted. So it's either one. You can either make a huge loaf of distinct looking bread, or you can make a small looking normal roll, like a biscuit. So you can make small amounts of dairy biscuits, or you can make a huge challah loaf that's done in a special funny looking thing, which might be connected to the fact that many people on Shavuot, I think the Ramah is, so this is Rav Yosef Karo speaking now. The Ramah is going to mention Shavuot there, and as long as the challah on Shavuot, which it generally is a different shape, or it should be, then it could be fine. And the Shulchan Aruch continues, one may not bake bread in an oven that was smeared with fat, and if one did, the rules are as for a dough kneaded with milk. So he says it's either way. Don't make meat bread or dairy bread unless there's, you do it in a special way. So if you make on Shabbat Noach, you make meat challah, which some people do with meat in it, juice or whatever, make it in the shape of an animal, then it's fine. Or make a really tiny one, like little cows and stuff. And Rabbi Moshe Isserles adds, thus we are accustomed to knead bread with milk for Shavuot, and also fat for the honor of Shabbat, because all of this is considered a small amount. So that's interesting thing here. Right now, we've been picturing like literally a tiny little piece of challah, but he says if you're making a single loaf just for the table, so maybe it means small rolls, then it might be okay. Also, its shape is distinct from other bread, and all the more so pastries made with meat like fladan or pashtira, which is like a quiche, are permitted. So he says if with challah you're allowed to do this, certainly when you're making these different like quiches and stuff that everybody knows are typically dairy. And again, I said in Israel today, there are, I think, official laws from, it may not just be the Rabbanut, it may be like officially, if you have a restaurant, I don't know if it's just a kosher thing, but you have to make your dairy pastries. I don't know what the shapes are in certain shapes, and that's consistent with this rule. So going back to the original question, can you ever make dairy bread? The answer is yes, as long as you hold by one of these exceptions. So that's pretty good so far.
That seems
Ken, go ahead.
It seems contradictory. First they say, no, the only time you can do it if it's small, but then if you do it, then, don't do it, throw it out. And now they're saying, well, wait a second. For Shavuos and for Shabbos, you can do it in a special way. So it's okay. So it's not kosher.
Well, I think I don't. Well, maybe you're picking on something I'm missing here. I would say it's not contradictory because I think the point they're making here is the Gemara said, "Don't do it unless you do this in Torah." What does it mean, like the eye of an ox? And there is a debate. It either means a small amount or a funny shape. The ruling is either of those count. We don't know exactly what the Gemara meant, but if you fulfill either of those things, then it's fine. And Rabbi Moshe Isserles is saying that challah on Shabbat does abide by that. So he's saying that the challah must be shaped differently. And so again, I'd have to look more into this. When Rabbi Moshe Isserles is saying that challah on Shabbat and Shavuot are shaped differently, does he mean specifically on a special Shabbos or on special Shavuot, and they actually make it unique? Because on a regular Shabbos, most challah, you go to Trader Joe's, you get a kosher challah, it's parev. So I don't know any places that are on a commercial setting that are selling challah that's not parev, regardless of the shape. So I don't think most people do this anyways. So maybe he is referring to a special practice only once in a while to make a very unique one. And also when he says a small amount that can be eaten in one sitting, does he mean one of those big challahs that covers you for 2 or 3 meals on Shabbos, or does he mean like individual rolls? So there's a lot of context here that's missing, but practically speaking, but then he goes on to something which does exist in practice, which is like all these little pastries, these fladon, which I don't know what it is, but pashtida, I believe, is quiche. At least in Tamar, you can nod your head if that's what it is in modern Hebrew. Pashtida is quiche. Oh, I'm going to unmute you because I want to make sure that I'm not incorrect. You just have to click on yourself.
Pashtida is a casserole.
Is a casserole. That's so interesting. How would you say quiche then?
Quiche.
I stand.
There is no word, not as far as I know. There is no word for
I'll only tell you why. There was a book I read as a kid with a character who loved quiche, and I went to Israel, read the book inside the bookstore. I think I did buy it too. I didn't treat it as a library. And the character was asking for quiche and said pashtida. So I made an assumption that they were directly translating it. And it was just like a kid's book. So maybe they're from America. So maybe they weren't doing it right. But regardless, the point is that this is in practice. They sell pastries that are probably some meat ones, but definitely dairy in Israel because there's a unique size. So that 100% is consistent across the board. But one of the questions here is, going back to Rabbi Moshe Isserles, he says, if you make a small amount, and it seems like it's not like making a tiny little drop or roll, it's how long it's gonna last you. So if I make a sliced sourdough, it's delicious, loaf with 20 pieces that could last me 2 weeks, especially with preservatives, then the rabbi's concern could be real. Again, if I make it in a different weird shape, fine. But usually, sliced loaf of bread could be a problem. So what does it mean that it doesn't last very long? So in the 19th century, Rabbi Yechiel Michel Epstein, the Aruch HaShulchan, writes this. Go ahead, Ken.
Okay. Yeah, I wondered if that casserole, sometimes you make a casserole, where you have like a pastry cover on top, which would bake like bread, and maybe that's what they're referring to there.
Could be, but whatever it is, it's something that must typically have dairy and be clearly recognizable. That's the key. And then source number 6 will really get more into what does it mean by recognizable. So source number 5 here is a little bit on what do we mean that it can be eaten in one setting. And this, by the way, take it to your homes. Rule this way. This is fine, what he says. So go ahead, source number 5.
Okay. And Rashi explained that baking a little bread like the eye of an ox that is eaten right away and doesn't last a long time is permitted, because in that small amount of time, we're not concerned that one will mess up and eat it with meat. And how long is this little amount of time? Up to 24 hours.
So he says in the Hebrew, kedei achilat yom echad, something like in order that can be, eaten in a day. So I translate it up to 24 hours, might be able, but basically something that you're going to eat in a day. But again, if I decide to, let's say for lunch, I have a little bit of dough. I'm using it for something else, and I want to take a piece of that dough, add a little bit of milk, and make in my toaster oven, which is dairy, a single roll. And I don't want to make it fancy shape or anything like that. That would be Beseder Gamor. That would be totally fine. Now, if I wanted to make a huge batch of rolls, but I made them in a weird shape that everyone would be like, why is it shaped that way? Then I could make them all dairy. So according to Aruch HaShulchan, as long as you're just making like, so it doesn't have to be literally a bite size, but it could be something that'll last you for a day. So that, by the way, would be consistent with what Ramah is saying in the Shulchan Aruch about chalot for Shabbat. And again, we could, before you make a decision, we could look a little bit more into this, ask me about it, but this is, pretty straightforward. And now the Aruch HaShulchan, and let's see, Tamar, we're back around to you. I'll mute on your side. And he has this really interesting story here, and I cut out, or maybe I summarized the second part of it at the end, but this is cool because he's mentioning a ruling of an earlier 16th century Greek rabbi, Rabbi Yosef Trani, known as the Maharit, and the mem is Morenu, Harav, Yosef Trani. And he talks about these little pastries that they made in their town that they made with fat. And how was that okay? And this goes in more to the other thing about them being recognizable. So Tamar, bevakasha.
The Gaon Maharit, Rabbi Yosef Trani, 16th century Greece, was asked about types of rolls that were baked with fat, meat, and were sold in the market. He responded that for the residents of the city, there was no concern since everyone knows this is the way they are made, and it is so well known that no one will eat them with a dairy. In spite of the fact that the practice of baking breading with meat.
Oh, that's a typo, baking bread with meat or dairy.
Is forbidden. In any case, now that it is already well known, it is no longer forbidden, and it's no worse than making a noticeable change which is permitted.
Excellent. So to clarify, everyone agrees that you can bake bread with dairy as long as you make it in a way and that it's distinct. It's a triangle shape or an octagon or something where everybody can recognize that it's a different shape. But it's saying here that in this town, they made these rolls. In Hebrew, it's gluskaot, which sounds like glucose. So they must be very sweet, even though they're made with this animal fat. But they're meat. They're kosher. They're made from kosher slaughtered animal fat, but in the kosher fat part. But they're meat rolls. But they're not made in a way that an outsider, an alien, could recognize it. But everyone in town. So let's say here in Milwaukee, they open up a kosher bakery and they make dairy rolls, and they don't make them look anything, or dairy loaves of bread, and they look the same as at any other bakery, but everybody knows that. So if we lived in a small town where everybody knew that, then it might be okay. The issue why it wouldn't apply to pretty much anywhere on the planet Earth today is we don't have towns like that anymore. We don't have towns where it's 99.9% the locals, and every 6 months one person, an outsider comes in. Here in Milwaukee, it's not a huge city, but it's big enough that it's hard for everybody to know something. But theoretically, if everybody knows, then it could be okay. But he points out that ideally, the law says, Jewish law says, the person should have been making this in a strange shape. But they didn't. And now, even though it's normally shaped rolls, everybody knows it, so it's fine. So if the person had said, can I make these meat rolls? He said, make them look different. He didn't. He said, after the fact, it's fine because everybody knows it's meat. No one's going to mess up. But then I didn't translate the rest of it, but I added a little summary here. If you want to go ahead and take that, Tamar.
Okay.
He goes on
to explain that for out-of-town travelers, there is still a problem. But if the fat is only a small amount, we can rely on one of 60th rule of nullification. And if they accidentally eat these rolls with dairy, it's not so bad.
By the way, this translation was, this summary was longer than me having translated it. And when I finished the summary, I was like, why didn't I just translate it? That was a waste of my own time. But the point is that he asked the question, everybody knows these are meat rolls, no problem, right? Well, what about outsiders? They're not going to recognize it. So this is really interesting. And this will come up again at the end of our shiur, which is, let's say, so again, if somebody makes these rolls in an interesting shape, it's fine. Everybody says it's okay. But he didn't. He made them in a normal shape. Now, if he made them with like, mostly meat, then they would be meat rolls and you could taste it or see it right away. But he put a little bit of fat in there. And there's a rule in Jewish law: if you accidentally spill some meat into a dairy thing, or accidentally spill a little bit of dairy, like a drop of milk, into a meat soup, and there's a lot more meat soup, literally more than 60 times as much, and it was an accident, then it's okay. It's as if that tiny little drop of dairy doesn't exist. This becomes very important in kitchen, industrial, private homes when accidents happen. Now, the problem here is this is done on purpose. But he's saying that this shouldn't have been done on purpose anyways, because he didn't do it in a special shape. But he did it and everyone knows, so it's fine now. But the idea of purposefully nullifying, being like, I have a giant vat of kosher stuff and it's 700 gallons and I'm going to put in a single eyedropper of pork because I want to call this pork drop, rolls or something, that is completely and totally forbidden by Jewish law. The nullification rule is only when it's an accident. So what he's saying here is, look, you shouldn't have been doing any of this, but it's already done. For most people in town who know it, it's fine. And for the outsiders who don't know it, and there's a good chance they'll buy this delicious bread and have it with a slice of cheese, even though we do not purposefully mix milk and meat, even when we know it's a tiny amount, technically there was so little fat, it's probably okay. So this is just like, how did we get in this situation? But he's saying technically none of this is good. This is all bad, but I guess it's okay. And now that's going to lead us into a real situation we have about English muffins and how that can be okay. Are they permitted, outright initially? So before we get to that, are there any questions about this source from the Shulchan Aruch, because it's so important for the rest of the class, which is, again, if you make the bread, meat or dairy bread, with a specific shape, totally fine. He brings this rabbi, the Maharit, who says that there's a town where they didn't make it in a special shape, but you know what? Everyone knows about it at this time, so it's okay. And for people who don't know about it, we rely on that rule that it got nullified, it disappeared, even though you may never do that intentionally. You may never add in a drop of milk or a drop of meat and saying, oh, it's just gonna like mix in there. There's more than 60 times. It's just, this comes to things like gelatin. I only need a single drop of gelatin to make this cohesive come together. You can't do that on purpose. So keep that in mind as we go to our final source. And I'll take, or actually second to last source. So this is an article right off of the OU's website. So this is their official source. And what's really cool is they're going to talk about everything we just learned. So they begin. Dairy bread was prohibited for consumption by a rabbinic injunction enacted over 2,000 years ago. The rabbis feared that since most bread is parev, which is true, a person might mistakenly eat dairy bread with meat products without realizing the dairy status of the bread. Meat bread is also restricted because it may accidentally be consumed with dairy items. So this little article is also a great summary of what we just read. There are two exceptions to this rule. Dairy bread or meat bread that has a unique shape is permissible because the shape will serve as a reminder that the bread is not parev. One may bake a small portion of bread, this is the or, may bake a small portion of bread which will be consumed in one meal, which was the Rambam and others before him, as it is assumed that one will remember the meat status without difficulty. So again, if I baked it that morning, hopefully by lunch, I'll still remember what I made with that bread. There are several brands of English muffins labeled OUD because they contain dairy ingredients, not dairy equipment, actual dairy. So how does the OU justify the certification of a dairy bread item? At one time, it was argued that English muffins have a unique shape and therefore the first leniency applies. English muffins don't look like other bread. That's a great argument. The way that they're shaped, the fluffiness, they look really distinct. Great. Problem. At the present, both dairy and parev English muffins are commercially available. As such, the unique shape of an English muffin does not currently alert one to the dairy status. So if there was a company, Thomas, that made bagels that literally were shaped like a cow and had milk in them, the OU should have no problem making that kosher. But English muffins, whether dairy or parev, look the same. So there's no way to know which one you're getting. So therefore, the Orthodox Union can no longer rely upon that. Others have suggested, when they say others, this is their official ruling, so, don't make it others, this is you guys. Others have suggested that a single muffin is generally eaten in one sitting. Oh, it's a small amount, and the second leniency above applies. This reasoning has been rejected as well, because muffins are typically sold in packages, which should be viewed as one unit. A package of muffins is certainly more than one serving. And again, with preservatives, a package of dairy English muffins can last you, well, depending on the preservatives, like 30, 40 years or something like that, but at least a week or two. Currently, and this is a big deal, this is their official ruling, and remember what we've learned. The primary justification to certify dairy English muffins is that the dairy component is less than 1 part in 60, which is halachically insignificant. So they used to be able to certify dairy English muffins because they looked unique. So this might be like that ruling of the Greek rabbi Maharit, where he said, look, they've already been doing it. People are used to it. They know there's dairy English muffins, so it's kind of grandfathered in. And the fact now that we have Parav one, so people might get confused, instead of taking away them being kosher, we'll rely on the 1/60th rule. Ordinarily, the OU does not certify a product that contains a non-kosher ingredient, even if used in small proportions, because halachically, we are not permitted to intentionally nullify a non-kosher entity. This is known, and they have the Hebrew phrase, bittul isur, they had a typo there, lechatchila, nullifying the forbidden thing intentionally at first. Dairy English muffins are not comparable because the milk component in and of itself is permissible. And when it is mixed in the batter at low levels, the milk does not attain a prohibited status. As such, preparation of dairy English muffins is justifiable. So there's this rule about nullification that if a little bit of pork falls in, accidentally I can ignore it. But here, there's nothing wrong with making, putting dairy into a Parav thing. It's totally fine. But ultimately, they're kind of glossing over the fact that they're relying on a rule that doesn't work. So what they're saying is, it's because if a bit of milk accidentally falls into a meat stew, you rely on this nullification thing. But this is putting dairy, even on purpose, into something which is Parav, except that justification, and I understand what they're doing. They're saying this whole thing about nullifying forbidden foods doesn't really apply here, except you're making a forbidden food. You are making a forbidden food because you're not allowed to make dairy bread unless it relies on a leniency, and those leniencies are now gone. So if you look at other rabbis, including this is actually a Sephardic rabbi from Israel, the Kaf HaChaim, Rabbi Yaakov Sofer. And he's really just reiterating the rule, but he and other rabbis are very explicit. Initially, intentionally mixing in less than 1/60th milk into some flour is forbidden. And since there is a debate about this, whether or not that's permitted, going back to the OU, is it okay, is it not okay? Initially, we may not do it, but if it was already done, it is not forbidden. So this is the interesting thing, is he's saying, look, we really shouldn't do it. But the fact that the OU is relying on it, I guess if you eat it, you haven't eaten forbidden, tray food. Although you really should be careful to make sure if you have a dairy English muffin to not eat it with meat, because that really is meat and milk. But what I found is that a lot of contemporary, so I think Sephardim are much stricter, and Sephardim just wouldn't, I'm not speaking for all Sephardim, but officially, Sephardic Jews would just not eat English muffins, and many Ashkenazi Jews, not all, but many, would be opposed to English muffins. There are many who just won't eat the dairy English muffins because of these concerns. So what we saw is the rabbis had a concern, but they said there's leniencies to get out of that concern. But English muffins really don't rely on those leniencies anymore. And what they're relying on is really, they would say, really b'diavad, really after the fact, really not ideal. So technically, is it maybe kind of okay? Yeah. If you're going to say, Rabbi Dinan, are you saying the OU or the dairy English muffins are treif? No, I'm not going to say that. Can it be kosher? Sure. Should we? Probably not. Or it's very, very questionable to begin with. So if you want to keep eating dairy English muffins, go for it. I probably will myself. Should we be doing it? Probably not. Because Susan's question about vegetarian, should we have a different ruling? No, this is the ruling. In 100 years, will it change? Maybe, but as long as the laws of meat and dairy exist and people eat bread, this is not a ruling that it makes sense to throw out. It's one to be extra careful about, especially with all these fancy breads and bakeries and pastries all over the world. So there is a fairly easy way to get around it. Make small amounts, make them in unique shapes. But if you don't do that, you can get into some murky territory. And that's something to be very conscious about and not take for granted.